You missed a spot, trash. Actually, you are the spot. Thorne, the COO of my company, sneered at me. I was wearing an oversized, itchy blue janitor's jumpsuit. I had spent the last 20 minutes polishing the white marble floor of the executive boardroom until it shone like a mirror. Thorne didn't care about my hard work. He reached over to the conference table, picked up a bottle of permanent black ink, and deliberately kicked it over. The dark liquid splashed everywhere, ruining the pristine surface. I watched the ink spread, feeling a lump grow in my throat. He didn't stop there. He stepped right into the middle of the black puddle with his expensive Italian leather shoes. Then, with a cruel smile, he walked over to me and wiped his ink-stained shoe on the leg of my jumpsuit. The entire board of directors, the men and women who were supposed to be the leaders of my empire, erupted in snickering. They looked at me like I was something they had scraped off the bottom of their shoes. Go find a bucket and crawl back to whatever gutter you came from, Thorne commanded, waving his hand as if to shoo away a fly. I stood there, the weight of the heavy mop feeling like lead in my hands. I could feel the hot prickle of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I was shaking with a mixture of sadness and pure, cold fury. Thorne turned his back to me, thinking I was just a ghost in the room. He leaned in close to the man beside him, my husband Bram. I saw Thorne whisper something into Bram's ear. He told him that he had already forged the signatures needed to sell the company behind the owner's back. They thought they were safe. They didn't know that my mop handle contained a high-sensitivity microphone that was recording every single word of their betrayal. My name is Riley, and for the last 7 years I have poured every ounce of my soul into building Elysium Tech. It started as a small project in a dusty garage, and I turned it into a billion-dollar empire. Because I am a very private person, I have always been a reclusive CEO. I never showed my face to the regional board or the public. I preferred to let my work speak for itself. However, lately, things had been going wrong. My turnover rate for employees had hit 40%, and I couldn't understand why good people were leaving my dream company in droves. I decided to go undercover to find the truth. I told my husband, Bram, and the board that I was going away to a remote spa retreat for a week to clear my head. Instead, I put on a wig, some fake glasses, and a janitor's uniform. I wanted to see how my leaders treated the people at the bottom. I wanted to see the real Elysium Tech when the boss wasn't looking. What I found on my very first day was a den of snakes. My own husband, Bram, was the chairman of this board. I had trusted him with my life and my legacy. As I mopped the floors, I heard Bram talking to Thorne. He laughed and said he was so glad his boring, workaholic wife was finally out of the way at her spa retreat. He told Thorne that it was the perfect time to finally gut the company and sell off the pieces for a massive profit. I felt like I had been stabbed in the heart. The man I loved was planning to destroy everything I had built while I was away. They thought I was a quiet, weak woman who only cared about her computers. They had no idea that the janitor they were mocking was the woman who owned the ground they stood on. I retreated to the employee break room, my hands still shaking from the encounter in the boardroom. The ink on my jumpsuit was starting to dry, and it felt heavy against my skin. I sat in a plastic chair, feeling completely alone. Suddenly, the door opened and the tea girl, Remy, walked in. I expected her to ignore me or look away in disgust like everyone else had done today. Instead, she walked straight over to me with a look of genuine concern on her face. She didn't see a trash janitor. She saw a person who was hurting. Without saying a word, she reached into her locker and pulled out a spare gray sweater. She handed it to me, along with a warm cup of herbal tea. "Don't let them break you," she whispered softly, sitting down beside me. "They think they are giants because they have big titles, but they are just loud and mean. You are worth more than they say." Her kindness was so unexpected that I almost started crying right then and there. She was the only person in this entire building who had shown me even a spark of humanity. We started talking, and I realized that Remy was much more than just a girl who served tea. She revealed to me that she was actually a brilliant former software engineer. She had worked in the development department for 2 years. She told me with a shaky voice that her patents and her best coding work had been stolen by one of the board members, a man named Soren. He had taken her ideas, claimed them as his own, and then demoted her to a service role so she couldn't complain. She was stuck here, serving tea to the man who stole her future. I realized then that the rot in my company went even deeper than I feared. The next morning, I was assigned to work near the office of Director Lowell. He was a man who always acted like he was the smartest person in the room, but everyone knew he was corrupt. He saw me passing by and snapped his fingers. "Hey, you! Use those hands for something useful," he barked. He handed me a massive stack of papers. He told me to take them to the high-speed shredder in the corner, mocking my reading level as he did so. He laughed and said he hoped the big machine wouldn't be too confusing for a janitor. I took the papers and walked to the shredder, but I didn't turn it on immediately. I started flipping through the pages, pretending to organize them. My heart stopped when I saw what was written on them. These weren't just random office memos or old reports. They were a series of formal termination letters. Thorne and Lowell were planning to fire every single employee who had been with Elysium Tech since the very first day in the garage. These were the people who had stayed loyal to me when we had no money and no fame. At the very top of the pile was a letter for Albin. Albin was my father's old business partner and a man who was like an uncle to me. He had mentored me and helped me build the first servers we ever used. Seeing his name on a firing list made my blood boil. They wanted to get rid of the old guard, so there would be no one left who remembered how the company was supposed to run. They wanted to clear out anyone who might be loyal to the real Riley. I tucked the most important letters into the waistband of my jumpsuit. I wasn't going to shred them. I was going to use them as evidence of their heartless plan. That evening, the board was hosting a grand gala to celebrate the upcoming merger. It was a black tie event filled with the city's wealthiest people. I wasn't invited as Riley, of course, but I was assigned to work the event as part of the cleaning crew. My job was the most humiliating one of all. I had to clean the women's bathrooms while the guests enjoyed expensive champagne and music. I stood in the corner of the lavish restroom, holding a spray bottle and a cloth, keeping my head down so no one would recognize me. While I was wiping the counters, my mother-in-law, Eulalie, walked in. She was wearing a diamond necklace that I had bought her for her last birthday. She was with her best friend, Clarabelle, and they were laughing loudly. Eulalie didn't even look at me. To her, I was just a piece of furniture. She stood at the mirror, fixing her lipstick, and started bragging about her son. She told Clarabelle how she had helped Bram trap me into marriage. She said they only wanted my shares and my wealth, and that I was too work-obsessed to notice they didn't actually love me. Then she said something that made the world spin around me. She laughed and admitted that she was the one who had tampered with my car's GPS system last month. She had caused that accident on the highway that almost sent me off a bridge. She said it was supposed to scare me into staying at home more so Bram could take over the office, but I had been too stubborn to die. I gripped the cleaning cloth so hard my knuckles turned white. My own family had tried to kill me for my money. I realized I wasn't just fighting for my company anymore. I was fighting for my life. The next morning, Thorne was in a foul mood. He cornered me in the hallway near the executive suites. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clear bag filled with white powder. He grabbed my arm roughly and shoved the bag toward me. "Listen up, trash," he hissed. "You're going to do me a little favor. Take this and plant it deep in the desk of Director Caius. If you don't do it, I'll tell security you stole my gold watch. You'll be in a jail cell before lunch." Thorne knew that Caius was the only honest person left on the board. Caius had been asking too many questions about the company's finances and the forged signatures. Thorne wanted to frame him for a crime so he could be fired and silenced forever. I looked at the bag and then at Thorne's arrogant, smug face. He thought he could use a lowly janitor to do his dirty work because I had no power to say no. I took the bag from his hand, nodding slowly like I was terrified. He patted my shoulder and walked away, whistling a tune. But I had no intention of hurting Caius. Thorne had forgotten that he was wearing his expensive tuxedo for a photo shoot later that day. I followed him to the dressing room area where his jacket was hanging on a rack. While the room was empty, I moved with the speed and precision I had used to build my first circuit boards. I didn't plant the powder in Caius's desk. Instead, I carefully sewed the small bag into the inner lining of Thorne's own tuxedo jacket. He was literally going to carry the evidence of his own corruption on his back. If he wanted a scandal, I was going to give him one he would never forget. A few hours later, The gala was in full swing again for the second night of festivities. I knew the timing was perfect. I used a burner phone to place an anonymous tip to the local police and the company's internal security. I told them that there were illegal substances being hidden by one of the executives in the VIP lounge. Within minutes, the atmosphere in the room changed. Security head Rafferty, a man who took his job very seriously, arrived with 3 other guards. They began a systematic sweep of the VIP area, checking bags and jackets. Thorne was standing in the center of the room, bragging to a group of investors. He looked like the king of the world in his tuxedo. When Rafferty approached him and asked to check his jacket, Thorne laughed out loud. "This is ridiculous. I'm the COO. You can't search me," he shouted, drawing a crowd. Rafferty didn't back down. He insisted on the search, citing the anonymous tip. Thorne, confident that he was clean, stripped off his jacket and tossed it to Rafferty with a sneer. "Go ahead, search it. You won't find anything but silk and success." Rafferty ran his hands along the lining and stopped when he felt the small lump. He pulled out a pocket knife, sliced the thread, and the bag of white powder fell onto the marble floor for everyone to see. The gasps from the crowd were deafening. Thorne's face went from pale to bright red. He looked around wildly, screaming that he had been framed. I watched from the shadows, leaning on my mop. To make sure my tracks were covered, I had already spent the morning hacking into the security system. I had reprogrammed the cameras to loop old footage, so there was no record of me ever being near his jacket. Thorne was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Even with the scandal of the powder, the board was desperate to keep their power. Bram took the stage at the gala, trying to calm the investors. He looked out at the crowd with a practiced, fake smile. He announced that the owner of Elysium Tech was far too ill to attend the event and had officially signed over full power of attorney to him. He held up a thick legal document, claiming it gave him total control over all assets and the upcoming merger. The investors, worried about Thorne's arrest, seemed to relax a little. They wanted someone to be in charge, and Bram looked the part. I moved closer to the stage, pretending to empty a trash can. I needed to see that document. As Bram waved it around, I caught a glimpse of the signature at the bottom. It looked like mine, but I noticed something that no one else would. The font used for the printed legal names was a very specific, rare typeface. It was the exact same one used by a forgery specialist I had been tracking for months named Rick. I had suspected for a long time that Bram was using a pro to fake my handwriting on smaller checks, but this was the big one. This document was the key to their entire plan to sell the company. If I could prove it was a forgery, the merger would be illegal and they would all go to prison. I realized that Bram hadn't just been waiting for me to go to a spa. He had been working with a criminal to steal my name. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The man I had shared a bed with was now a stranger who wanted to erase my existence. I looked at the microphone on my mop. It was still recording. I had Bram on tape earlier that day, talking to Rick on the phone about the final signature. The trap was almost set. I found Remy in the shadows near the kitchen. She looked worried, her eyes darting around the room. She beckoned me over to a quiet corner where no one could hear us. "Riley, or whoever you really are," she whispered, looking at my fake glasses. "I found something on the network. I used the guest Wi-Fi to bypass the board's firewalls. I've been tracking their private crypto wallets for weeks." She showed me her tablet, which was filled with complex charts and transaction logs. She was even more brilliant than I had imagined. She explained that the merger with the rival company was a complete lie. It wasn't a merger at all. It was a front for a massive money laundering scheme. Thorne, Bram, and Soren were planning to move all of Elysium Tech's cash into a shell company and then let the main company go bankrupt. Thousands of people would lose their jobs and their pensions, while the board walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the names on the shell company's registration. The buyer of the company, the person who owned the shell firm, was listed as a woman named Brielle. My breath caught in my throat. Brielle was my own younger sister. I had been paying for her medical school tuition and her luxury apartment for years. I thought she was studying to be a surgeon, but it turned out she was part of the plan to ruin me. My husband, my mother-in-law, and my sister were all working together to tear down everything I loved. I felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down. I couldn't afford to be weak. I had to be the CEO now. The next day, the tension in the office was at a breaking point. I was carrying a heavy tray of expensive crystal glasses into the board's private lounge for a celebratory lunch. Soren, the man who had stolen Remy's patents, was standing in the doorway. As I tried to walk past him, he deliberately stuck out his foot. I tripped, and the tray flew from my hands. The sound of shattering crystal filled the hallway, and I fell hard onto my knees. Shards of glass sliced into my palms, and I gasped in pain. Bram walked over, looking down at me with pure hatred in his eyes. He didn't offer to help me up. Instead, he reached out and ground the heel of his shoe into my hand, right over a fresh cut. "Get this filth out of here," he snarled, leaning down so only I could hear him. "You're a clumsy, pathetic waste of space. If I see you in this hallway again, I'll make sure you never work in this city again." He laughed as I winced. Then he turned back to the others as if I were nothing more than a broken glass. But Bram had made a huge mistake in getting that close to me. While I was on the floor, pretending to scramble for the glass shards, my hands were busy. I am a tech mogul for a reason. I know how to move fast with hardware. In the 3 seconds he spent mocking me, I managed to reach into his pocket and swap his high-end smartphone with a cloned version I had been carrying in my jumpsuit. The clone looked and felt identical, but it was already sending every message, photo, and call log directly to my private server. As I limped away with my bucket of broken glass, I knew I finally had the keys to his digital life. I locked myself in the small, dark janitor's closet on the 4th floor. It smelled of bleach and old mops, but it was the only place I was safe. I opened my laptop and began scrolling through the data from Bram's cloned phone. My hands were still bleeding from the glass shards, but I didn't care about the pain anymore. The truth was far more painful. I found a secret gallery of photos that made my stomach churn. There were dozens of pictures of Bram with a woman named Fallen. They were at our private summer home. The one Bram told me was under renovation. They looked happy, like a real couple, while I was back at the office working 18-hour days to provide for our future. Then, I dug deeper into Fallen's identity. My blood ran cold when I saw her LinkedIn profile and her payroll records. Fallen was the lead investigator for the external firm that was supposed to be auditing Elysium Tech. Bram wasn't just cheating on me. He was sleeping with the woman who was responsible for checking the company's books. This was why the auditors had never found the forged signatures or the missing millions. The audit was a sham. Fallen was helping Bram hide his crimes in exchange for a share of the money. I found messages between them where they laughed about how clueless I was. They planned to take the money and move to a country without an extradition treaty as soon as the merger was finalized. I saved every single photo and message. I had the husband, the sister, the mother-in-law, and the auditor all tied together in one giant web of corruption. I looked at the clock. Day 3 was almost over. It was time for the final act. Day 3 began with a heavy, gray sky outside. The board called an emergency meeting in the glass room, a high-tech conference area with floor-to-ceiling windows. I was sent in to empty the trash and freshen up the space before they started. They didn't even stop talking when I entered. They were so convinced of their own power that they treated me like I was invisible. Thorne, who was out on bail, was laughing loudly. He told the others that they were going to liquidate the company by 5 p.m. that evening and have the cash moved to the shell accounts. "By tonight, Riley won't have a penny left to her name," Bram said, leaning back in his chair. "She'll come back from her spa and find out she's bankrupt and homeless. I almost feel sorry for her." Almost. The others laughed, clinking their glasses together. They discussed how they would fire the remaining loyal staff and blame the entire collapse on Riley's bad management while she was away. They were so arrogant, so sure that their plan was perfect. They had no idea that their every word was being broadcast to my private server. Before I left the room with the trash, I made one final move. I didn't just empty the bin, I replaced it with a specialized unit. I purposely left the trash can, which contained a hidden 360-degree high-definition camera, right under the center of the conference table. From that angle, the camera could see everyone's face and every document they placed on the table. I walked out of the room, closing the heavy glass doors behind me. I went straight to the basement to meet Remy. It was time to stop being the janitor and start being the CEO again. The meeting in the glass room was nearly over when Thorne noticed me standing near the door again. He was riding high on the excitement of his plan, and he decided he wanted one last bit of entertainment before he became a multimillionaire. He stood up and pointed at me, calling me into the center of the room. "You know, I've decided I don't like the way you look," he said, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You're an eyesore. You're fired, janitor, effective immediately." The board members laughed, watching the poor janitor get humiliated one last time. Thorne stepped closer, his face twisted in a cruel grin. "And because you broke those expensive crystal glasses yesterday, I'm making sure you leave with zero pay. In fact, we're going to sue you for the damages. It'll take you the rest of your life to pay us back." He looked at Bram, expecting him to join in. Bram just nodded coldly, his eyes showing no mercy. They thought they were destroying a helpless woman's life for fun. I stood my ground, my heart beating fast but my voice steady. I looked Thorne right in the eye, something no janitor would ever do. "I'm not leaving, Thorne," I said, my voice sounding louder and clearer than they expected. The room went silent. Thorne blinked, confused by my tone. "What did you just say to me?" he barked. I stepped forward, dropping the heavy mop onto the floor with a loud thud. "I said I'm not leaving, but you are, all of you are." Thorne started to laugh, but the laughter died in his throat when he saw the look in my eyes. I reached up to the collar of my jumpsuit and grabbed the heavy brass zipper. The board members started to snicker again. Thorne even made a joke about me having a breakdown in front of them. "What are you doing, you freak? Get out before I call security," he shouted. I didn't answer. I pulled the zipper down in one smooth motion and stepped out of the itchy blue overalls. Underneath the janitor's uniform, I was wearing a perfectly tailored $1,000 charcoal gray suit. I reached up, pulled off the messy wig, and took off the fake, thick glasses. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Bram's face went from smug to a ghostly, sickly shade of white. He stood up so fast his chair fell over. "Riley," he whispered, his voice cracking with terror. I shook out my hair and stood tall, looking at the men who had mocked me for 3 days. "Hello, Bram, how was the merger meeting?" I asked, a cold smile on my face. Thorne was frozen, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. They looked like they were seeing a ghost. Just then, the glass doors opened and Remy walked in. She wasn't carrying a tea tray this time. She was holding a high-tech tablet. She tapped the screen, and the giant monitors on the walls, the ones Thorne was using for his presentation, flickered to life. They were currently broadcasting our live boardroom feed, along with the 360-degree trash can footage, to every single one of the 5,000 employees in the building and every satellite office around the world. Every person Thorne had planned to fire was now watching him realize his life was over. Bram's face turned the color of ash as he looked at the monitors and then back at me. "Riley, what? What is this? It's a joke, right?" he stammered, his hands shaking violently. I stepped closer to the table, looking at the man I had once loved. "This is a performance review, Bram, and I've spent the last 3 days watching you. You, Thorne, Soren, Lowell, you all just failed." The board members were scrambling now, trying to cover their documents and turn off the monitors, but Remy had locked the system. They were trapped in a digital cage of their own making. I tapped a button on my own watch, and the audio from the gala's bathroom played through the room's speakers. It was the recording of Bram and Eulalie discussing the car accident they had arranged for me. Bram's knees buckled, and he fell back into his seat. "You tried to kill me, Bram. Your own mother tampered with my car so you could play CEO while I was in a hospital bed. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" I asked, my voice echoing with the pain of his betrayal. The employees watching the stream were flooding the internal chat with messages of shock and fury. Thorne tried to regain some of his arrogance. He stood up and pointed at the door. "So what? You're the CEO. You still can't prove we did anything illegal. This is just a domestic dispute. Get out of my office." He was still trying to bluff his way out of the disaster. He didn't realize that I hadn't just been mopping floors. I had been building a legal mountain that was about to fall right on his head. I looked at the door, and right on cue, it opened again. The masculine vision Thorne was so proud of was about to meet a very hard reality. Soren tried to call the police on his own phone, screaming that I was harassing the board and had hacked the building. He was desperate to have me removed before I could say anything else. "Officer, come to the 4th floor, we have an intruder," he shouted into his phone. He looked at me with a triumphant sneer, thinking he had won. "You're going to jail for this, Riley. You can't just spy on us." The other board members started nodding, trying to regain their composure. They thought the law would protect them, because they were rich and powerful. The heavy glass doors swung open once more, and a man in a sharp, dark suit walked in. It wasn't the regular campus security. It was Bennett, the city's most feared and respected prosecutor. He had a team of federal agents behind him, all carrying tablets and folders. Soren's jaw dropped, and he slowly lowered his phone. Bennett didn't even look at Soren. He walked straight over to me and handed me a file. "Good morning, Riley," he said with a professional nod. "I've finished reviewing the logs from your janitor equipment. It's even more comprehensive than we expected." Bennett turned to the board, his eyes cold and professional. "For the last 2 days, I have been Riley's janitor assistant, working the night shift to verify the data she was collecting. We have every conversation, every forged signature, and every illegal wire transfer recorded and timestamped." The board members looked at each other in total panic. They realized now why the new guy on the cleaning crew had been so quiet and efficient. I had brought the law into the building 3 days ago, and they had been too busy mocking me to notice. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out the forged power of attorney document that Bram had shown at the gala. I threw it onto the center of the mahogany table. "Emric already confessed, Bram," I said, watching him flinch at the name of his forgery specialist. "We picked him up 2 hours ago. He told us everything. He said you paid him $50,000 in Bitcoin to mimic my signature on the sale documents." Bram tried to say something, but no words came out. He just stared at the paper as if it were a poisonous snake. "And that's not all," I continued, turning to the monitors. I pulled up the company's Emergency Relief Fund bank statements. This was the money I had set aside to help employees who were facing medical crises or family emergencies. "The Bitcoin you used to pay for your crimes didn't come from your own pocket, Bram. You stole it from the employees. You used the money meant for their sick children to pay a criminal to steal my company." The gasps from the hallway were audible through the glass. The employees were now gathering outside the room, their faces filled with rage. I looked at Lowell and Soren. "And you too. I have the logs of the patents you stole from Remy. I have the emails where you discussed burying her career so you could take the credit for the AI architecture." Remy stood tall beside me, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and triumph. The board was no longer a group of powerful executives. They were a group of caught criminals, stripped of their titles and their dignity. Bennett's team began placing digital locks on every computer in the room. The merger was officially dead, and so were their careers. Suddenly, the door burst open and my mother-in-law, Eulalie, stormed into the office. She was still wearing her expensive designer suit from her morning lunch, and she was fuming. She hadn't seen the live stream yet, and she had no idea the room was filled with federal agents. She marched straight up to me, pointing a manicured finger in my face. "Riley, what is the meaning of this? Why are the servants saying you're back? Get back in your place, you little peasant. You're supposed to be at a spa, letting my son handle the real work." The room went deathly silent. Bram tried to wave her away, his face twisted in a look of pure agony, but she wouldn't stop. "Don't you look at me like that, Bram. I told you she was trouble the day you met her. We should have finished the job with the car last month." She was screaming now, her voice echoing through the entire building. She had just confessed to attempted murder in front of a room full of witnesses and 5,000 employees watching the live stream. She finally looked around and noticed Bennett and the agents. Her hand slowly dropped to her side. I tapped a button on the conference table, and the audio of her confession from the bathroom played one last time, followed by her screaming just now. "Thank you for the confirmation, Eulalie," I said, my voice like ice. "The entire staff of Elysium Tech just heard you admit to sabotaging my car. They also heard you call them peasants and servants for the last 3 days." Eulalie looked at the monitors, saw her own face, and realized the janitor she had ignored was the woman who was about to send her to prison. She sank into a chair, finally silent. I turned my back on Eulalie and looked at the board members who were still sitting at the table. I felt a strange sense of calm. The weight I had been carrying for 3 days, the weight of the mop and the weight of their insults, was finally gone. I leaned over the table and looked at Thorn, Lowell, and Soren. "You're all fired," I said, my voice echoing with the authority of the CEO they had tried to erase. "Effective 60 seconds ago, your access to the building, the network, and the company's accounts has been permanently revoked." Thorn tried to stand up, his face red with anger. "You can't do that. We have contracts. We have shares," he shouted. Bennett stepped forward, holding a stack of legal documents. "Actually, Mr. Thorne, under the moral turpitude clause in your executive contracts, your shares and your severance are forfeited in the event of criminal activity against the company. Since we have evidence of forgery, theft, and conspiracy, you are leaving with nothing." The federal agents began handing out formal arrest warrants to each of them. Thorne's arrogance finally collapsed, and he sat down, burying his face in his hands. I turned to Remy and smiled. "Remy, I am officially nomming you the new Chief Operating Officer of Elysium Tech. Your first act is to work with Bennett to restore every patent that was stolen from you and the other engineers." Remy's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded firmly. "I'm on it, Riley," she said. The employees outside the room began to cheer, the sound muffled by the glass but still powerful. I had spent 7 years building this company, but in the last 3 days, I had finally learned how to lead it. I turned my attention to the most painful betrayal of all. I looked at the door and signaled for someone to enter. A young woman walked in, looking terrified. It was my sister, Brielle. She saw me standing there in my suit and let out a small sob. "Riley, I'm so sorry. They told me you were going to sell the company anyway. They said it was the only way to save my future," she cried, her voice trembling. She looked at Bram, who wouldn't even look at her. She realized now that she had been just another tool in their plan. I looked at the sister I had raised and supported since our parents died. "I paid for your life, Brielle. I paid for your school, your home, your clothes. And you used that money to help them steal mine." I pulled up the bank records on the monitor. "You initiated the transfer of the first 10 million to the shell company yesterday. You weren't forced, Brielle. You were greedy." Brielle started to wail, begging for my forgiveness, but I felt nothing but a cold, hard stone in my chest. She had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. "I've already contacted the dean of your medical school, Brielle. Your tuition has been officially canceled, and I've revoked your access to the family trust," I told her. "You wanted to be an owner. Well, now you own nothing. You can find a job and pay for your own life from now on." The federal agents led her out along with the others. She had been my little sister for 20 years, but today she was just another person who had tried to destroy my dream. I watched her go, realizing that the family I thought I had was just a beautiful lie. Bram was the last one left at the table. He was sitting in the same chair where he had mocked me 3 days ago. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Riley, please, we can talk about this. I was just scared of losing you. I thought if I had the company, you'd finally respect me," he lied, his voice sounding hollow and weak. He actually thought he could still manipulate me with love. He thought I was still the same boring workaholic, wife who would forgive him anything. I walked over to the corner of the room and picked up the heavy, ink-stained mop I had dropped earlier. I walked back to the table and handed it to him. "Since you like floors so much, Bram, you can start your new career today. It's the only job you're qualified for now," I said. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the divorce papers I had Bennett prepare last night. I dropped them onto the table right in front of him. "Sign them, Bram, now." He looked at the papers and then at me. "You're taking everything, our house, my savings?" he asked. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The postnup you signed 3 years ago, the one you didn't think I'd ever use, awards me 100% of your marital property in the event of fraud or criminal activity. You're leaving this room with the clothes on your back and that mop, nothing else." Bram realized then that the simple wife he had tried to trap was the one who had set the trap for him from the very beginning. He signed the papers with a shaking hand, his life as a billionaire chairman over forever. Bram tried to make one last desperate argument before the agents led him away. He stood up, clutching the mop handle, and looked at the federal agents. "This company is mine too. I built the culture. I managed the people. You can't just throw me out like a janitor," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying, wild light. "You were just the coder, Riley. I was the face of Elysium Tech. Without me, this place is nothing." He truly believed his own lies. He thought his charisma was what made the company a billion-dollar empire. I didn't say a word. I simply turned to the monitors and pulled up the original code logs from the last 5 years. I pointed to the admin access history. "Look at the screen, Bram. In the last 5 years, you haven't logged into the system once. You haven't reviewed a single line of code, and you haven't approved a single technical update. Even the janitors have more system access than you did. I showed the logs of his daily activities, 4-hour lunches, golf games, and marketing trips with Fallen. He had been a parasite, living off the blood and sweat of the people he looked down on. The agent stepped forward and placed the handcuffs on his wrists. Bram looked at the cold steel and then back at the monitors. The evidence of his uselessness was there for the whole world to see. He had been the face of the company, but the face was just a mask for a man who had no substance. As he was led out of the glass room, the employees in the hallway didn't stay silent. They began to hiss and boo, the sound of 5,000 voices telling him exactly what they thought of his leadership. He was leaving as a criminal, and he was leaving alone. Remy walked to the front of the room and signaled for the employees to gather in the main lobby. She led the disgraced board members out through the heavy glass doors. They had to walk a gauntlet of the very people they had planned to fire. Thorne, Lowell, Soren, and Bram were marched through the center of the lobby, their heads down as the cameras from the local news crews flashed in their faces. They looked small and defeated, stripped of their power and their expensive titles. As they reached the center of the lobby, something happened that wasn't in the plan. The employees, led by Albin and the old guard, were lined up in 2 long rows. Every single one of them was holding a mop and a bucket filled with dirty, gray water from the morning's cleaning. As Thorne and Bram passed by, the employees didn't use violence. They simply tipped their buckets, pouring the dirty water onto the floor right at the feet of the men who had called them trash and peasants. Thorne slipped on the wet marble, falling into the puddle he had helped create. It was a silent, powerful act of revenge. They were showing the board exactly what it felt like to be looked down on and ignored. Remy stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the men who had stolen her future. "You wanted to liquidate the company," she called out over the crowd. "Well, consider yourselves liquidated." The lobby erupted in cheers and applause. The snakes were finally out of the garden, and the people who actually built Elysium Tech were the ones left standing. I stood at the balcony, watching them go, feeling a deep sense of pride in the team I had almost lost. An hour later, I arrived at the Sterling Mansion. It was a massive, cold house that had always felt more like a museum than a home. I found Eulalie in the grand foyer, surrounded by her designer bags and expensive statues. She had been released on bail, but she had no money left to pay for her life. She saw me and started screaming again, claiming I was robbing her of her rightful home. "This is Bram's house. You can't just take it. I have a right to live in luxury." She shrieked, clutching a gold-plated clock. I didn't even go inside. I stood on the driveway with Kellen and Riven, the heads of my new repossession and security team. I handed Kellen the legal eviction notice. "You have 10 minutes to pack whatever you can carry in 2 bags, Eulalie," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The house, the cars, and everything inside is legally mine. I've already donated your entire jewelry collection to the city's domestic violence shelter. They can use the money to help women who have been abused by families just like yours." Eulalie looked like she was going to have a heart attack. She looked at the gold clock, then at the agents, and realized she had no more cards to play. She was a woman who had built her entire identity on being better than everyone else, and now she was being kicked out of her palace by the woman she had tried to kill. She packed 2 small bags, her hands shaking, and walked out of the mansion for the last time. She didn't look at me as she passed. She just walked down the long driveway, a lonely, bitter woman with nothing but her designer luggage and her hate. A week later, I was back in my office at Elysium Tech. The atmosphere in the building had completely changed. The glass room was no longer a place for secret deals and insults. It was now the innovation hub, where engineers and service staff worked together to improve our products. The turnover rate had dropped to 0, and the company's stock was higher than it had ever been. People weren't just working for a paycheck anymore. They were working for a company that finally saw them. Remy walked into my office carrying 2 cups of herbal tea. She didn't knock. She was my partner now. We sat by the window looking out at the city's skyline. "We did it, Riley," she said, a peaceful smile on her face. We looked down at the street below and saw a group of people in orange vests. They were doing community service, picking up trash and cleaning the gutters. I saw a familiar, balding head. It was Thorne, and beside him was Lowell. They were finally learning what it felt like to do the work they had mocked for so long. I looked at my reflection in the window. I wasn't wearing a janitor's jumpsuit anymore, But I wasn't the reclusive CEO who hid in her office either. I was the woman who saw everything. I had learned that a billion-dollar empire is nothing if it doesn't have a heart. I took a sip of my tea and leaned back in my chair. The tea girl and the janitor were now the most powerful women in the tech world, and we were just getting started. I looked at the digital clock on my wall. The new era of Elysium tech had officially begun.